I'd always heard that life can change in the blink of an eye. People said it so casually, like a throwaway line you'd hear in passing. But no one actually thinks it'll happen to them. Not until the day it does. For me, that day came out of nowhere, and it left me utterly exposed to a reality I'd been avoiding. A year ago, I had to undergo surgery. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a procedure that would sideline me for a while. Nothing to worry about, the doctors said, but deep down I was terrified. And as I lay there staring at the sterile white ceiling of the hospital, I felt a loneliness that I'd never experienced before. I kept waiting for him, my boyfriend, the one person I thought I could count on. But he never showed up. Message after message went unanswered, and the silence around me grew louder with each passing hour. At first I told myself there must be a reason. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he had a work emergency. But then a day passed, and another. My phone stayed silent and the empty chair next to my bed remained empty. I tried to distract myself, telling myself that any minute now he'd walk through that door, or my phone would ring with a comforting message. But deep down, I was starting to realize the harsh truth. I wasn't a priority. Not to him, not to anyone, it seemed. Lying in that hospital bed, hooked up to IV drips and monitors, I had nothing but time to think. I thought about all the times I'd put him first, all the sacrifices I'd made to make him happy, hoping he'd one day do the same for me. And yet here I was, at one of the most vulnerable moments of my life, completely alone. I felt a pang of shame, not just for believing in him, but for allowing myself to become so dependent on someone who saw me as nothing more than an option. I'd been blinded by love and loyalty to a person who couldn't be bothered to show up when it mattered most. And as those lonely days stretched on, I realized just how foolish I'd been. I'd built my world around someone who wasn't willing to make even the smallest effort for me. The painful realizations settled in my chest like a weight, and I couldn't shake it. The days in the hospital blurred together. Nurses came and went, their faces blurring into one, as they checked my vitals and adjusted my IV. But no one came to sit by my side, no one to hold my hand or tell me everything was going to be okay. I started to wonder if anyone would even notice if something went wrong. If I just disappeared. That's how isolated I felt, like a ghost trapped in a world that had forgotten I existed. When I was finally discharged, I thought maybe things would be different. Maybe he'd come around, realize how much I'd needed him, and show some remorse. But as I opened my phone, to find nothing but unread messages and missed calls from people who weren't him, the truth hit me like a slap in the face. He didn't care. And honestly, I didn't know if he ever had. Alright, here's written with detailed inner reflections and emotional depth. This part will provide context on the protagonist's past experiences of being overlooked and the family dynamics that contributed to their feelings of neglect. Let's dive in. Growing up, I was never the one people looked at twice. Not in my family, not at school, and definitely not among my so-called friends. It was like I'd been cast in the role of the background character in everyone else's lives. But it wasn't always easy to accept that role, especially when you're young, hoping someone might actually see you for who you are. My family was the first place I learned about neglect, quietly, subtly, but in a way that hurt just as much. I had an older sister, Kara, and to everyone around us, she was the star. She had the perfect grades, the charm, and the smile that made people light up. And honestly, I didn't hate her for it. It wasn't her fault she was adored. But every time our parents looked at her with that pride in their eyes, I couldn't help but feel the sting of being overlooked. I remember this one time, when I was about 12, and I'd won a small art competition at school. It wasn't anything big, but to me, it felt like an achievement. I rushed home, clutching that little certificate, heart pounding with excitement, hoping for just a few words of praise. I showed it to my mom, waiting for her to smile, to say she was proud of me. But she just glanced at it, nodded, and went back to whatever she was doing. I tried to brush it off, but when I heard her later on the phone, gushing about Kara's latest dance recital, I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. That's how it always was. Me, hoping for just a moment of recognition, and them, giving it all to Kara. Over time, I learned to shrink myself, to fade into the background. I thought maybe if I made myself small enough, the constant sting of rejection wouldn't hurt as much. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, that feeling of being invisible stayed with me. And it wasn't just my family. Even among my friends, I was always the one who had to make the plans, the one who reached out first, the one who gave more. I remember countless times when I'd stay up late, talking to them about their problems, listening to their heartbreaks, trying to be the friend they needed. But when it came to my struggles, my pain, it was like they couldn't hear me. I'd share my worries, my fears, and they'd nod, maybe say a quick, "I'm sure things will work out," and then shift the conversation back to themselves. I guess that's what led me to cling so tightly to my boyfriend. I thought, finally, here's someone who sees me, who cares about me. I wanted to believe so badly that he was different, that he wouldn't treat me like everyone else did. But looking back, I can see now that he was just like them, taking all I had to give without ever offering anything in return. The realization was slow, creeping up on me bit by bit. At first, it was small things, the way he'd cancel plans last minute, always with a flimsy excuse that never quite made sense. Or the way he'd forget important dates like my birthday or our anniversary, and then try to laugh it off like it was no big deal. Each time I'd forgive him, telling myself that maybe he just had a lot on his mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. He didn't value me enough to remember. And yet, despite all the signs, I stayed. I held on to the hope that maybe, one day he'd see me, really see me, and realize just how much I was worth. I clung to that hope like a lifeline, convincing myself that if I just loved him hard enough, he'd finally love me back. But now, as I look back on those years, I can see how foolish I was. I'd spent so much of my life waiting for my parents to notice me, for my friends to be there for me, and for him to love me. I'd given so much of myself, poured so much of my heart into people who couldn't be bothered to give me even a fraction of that in return. And here I was, still waiting, still hoping for people to change. That hospital experience was the turning point, the moment I could no longer ignore the painful truth. I was alone, and I had been for a long time. My family, my friends, even the man I loved, they'd all taken and taken, leaving me empty and forgotten, and I couldn't keep pretending that things would ever be different. After I got out of the hospital, I tried to piece myself back together. I told myself that everything would go back to normal, that I'd bury the pain, the loneliness, and pretend I hadn't seen that ugly truth about my life. But deep down, something had shifted. I could no longer ignore the emptiness, the way everyone seemed to just exist around me, without ever truly being with me. At first, I thought I'd just been overthinking. Maybe the hospital had made me vulnerable, made me imagine betrayals where there were none. So I pushed the doubts away, trying to convince myself that things were fine. And then, just when I thought I might have some stability, that maybe he'd come through for me this time, it happened again. A new betrayal, one that would cut me deeper than any before. One evening he called, sounding unusually upbeat. He told me he had a surprise planned, something special that would make up for lost time. I was so starved for affection, for any sign that he actually cared, that I jumped at the chance. I dressed up, did my hair and makeup, and waited by the door, imagining all the ways he'd try to make things right. Maybe he'd take me out to a nice dinner, or surprise me with a little gift. Silly, I know, but after everything, I was willing to take whatever scrap of attention he'd give. But when he showed up, there was no smile, no warmth in his eyes. Instead, he barely looked at me, his gaze flitting to his phone every few minutes. The entire evening, he seemed distracted, like he was just going through the motions, while his mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just stressed, maybe had a lot on his plate. But the feeling in my gut told me something was wrong, and I couldn't shake it. Then, a few days later, I found out the truth in the most brutal way possible. It started with a simple, harmless conversation. My friend, let's call her Rachel, was telling me about how she'd gotten to drive a luxury car recently, something she could only dream of. She mentioned how her friend had let her borrow it for a weekend, saying he wanted her to feel special. She went on, laughing and gushing about how generous he was, how sweet he must be to lend her something so valuable. I felt a pang of jealousy for her, envying the kind of friendship she had with someone so thoughtful. And then, the more she talked, the colder I felt. Her description of the car, right down to the color, matched my boyfriend's. Every detail she shared was like a stab to my heart, piecing together a puzzle I didn't want to complete. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to know the truth. So I pressed her for more, gently, pretending I was just curious. "Did he, by any chance, have a tattoo on his wrist?" I asked, my voice as steady as I could make it. Rachel nodded, smiling. "Yeah, how did you know?" "It's a small one, right? Just a little symbol or something. He didn't seem like the type, so it was kind of surprising." I felt my stomach twist, the betrayal sinking in deeper than I'd thought possible. That was him. My boyfriend, lending his car to my friend, treating her to the kind of kindness he'd never shown me. And the worst part? He'd never even mentioned it. Not a word. He'd let me believe he was too busy to visit me in the hospital, too stressed to answer my messages while he was out there with her, making her feel special in ways he'd never bothered to with me. I sat there, listening to her go on and on about how thoughtful he was, the bile rising in my throat. I wanted to scream, to tell her the truth, to show her the ugly side of the man she was so enamored with. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just smiled and nodded, pretending everything was fine, even as my heart shattered into a million pieces. When I confronted him about it later, he didn't even try to deny it. "She's just a friend," he said, rolling his eyes like I was being unreasonable. "I was just trying to cheer her up. You know she's been going through a rough time." The audacity of it all left me speechless. A rough time? She was going through a rough time? And what about me? What about all the nights I'd spent crying myself to sleep waiting for a message that never came? What about the weeks in the hospital, lying alone, wondering if anyone even cared if I made it through? But he didn't see it. He never had. To him, my pain was just an inconvenience, something that got in the way of his life. And that realization, finally seeing him for who he truly was, hurt more than I could put into words. I'd given him everything, poured my heart and soul into our relationship, only to be repaid with lies and betrayal. And now, here I was, staring at the empty shell of a relationship I'd held onto for far too long, wondering how I'd been so blind. But as painful as it was, that moment was also a turning point. For the first time, I started to see that maybe, just maybe, I deserved better. That maybe it was time to stop waiting for someone else to save me and saving myself. After that confrontation, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation, not some bold declaration of independence. No, it was quieter than that, more like a tired resignation. I'd been fighting so hard, clinging to this hope that someday he'd wake up, that he'd see me, value me. But that night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of it all settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd been fooling myself, hadn't I? The signs had been there all along. Every broken promise, every empty apology, every moment he chose someone else over me, it had all been leading to this. I'd just been too afraid to see it, to face the truth, that I was worth more than this half-hearted love, this constant rejection. The next morning, I looked in the mirror, really looked. I could barely recognize the person staring back at me. My face was pale, eyes tired and dull, shoulders slumped under the weight of all the things I'd held inside. I'd spent so much time, so much energy, trying to make everyone else happy, trying to fit myself into the mold of the person they wanted me to be. But what about me? When had I last done something for myself? That day, I made a decision, a quiet, stubborn decision, that I wouldn't let myself go on like this. I didn't know how or when, but I knew I needed to break free from this toxic cycle, to find a way out of the prison I'd built around myself. And that meant letting go of him, of the man I'd loved with every piece of my heart, even if he'd never loved me back the same way. It wasn't easy. The thought of leaving him, of stepping out into a world where I had no one to lean on, terrified me. I'd built my entire life around him, around this fantasy that one day we'd have the kind of relationship I'd always dreamed of. And now, I was faced with the reality that it was all a lie, a fragile illusion that had shattered the moment I'd seen him for who he truly was. I started small, taking baby steps toward reclaiming myself. I stopped waiting for his calls, stopped checking my phone every few minutes, hoping for a message that would never come. I stopped making excuses for him, stopped telling myself that maybe he'd change, maybe he'd come around. And in the quiet moments, when the loneliness crept in and I felt the urge to reach out to him, I reminded myself of all the times he'd let me down, all the nights I'd cried myself to sleep because of him. It hurt. It hurt like hell, but I knew it was the only way I'd ever truly heal. I began to focus on myself, on rebuilding the pieces of my life that had crumbled under the weight of his neglect. I reconnected with old hobbies, things I'd given up to make more time for him. I took long walks, breathed in the fresh air, and felt the sun on my face. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of freedom, a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. People around me began to notice the change. My friends, the ones I'd drifted away from in my blind devotion to him, reached out, inviting me to coffee, to dinners, reminding me of what it felt like to be valued, to be seen. And slowly I began to open up to them, sharing my struggles, my heartbreak. It was hard, painful even, to admit how much I'd let myself endure. But with every word, with every tear shed in their presence, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger. And then, one day, it happened, the moment I'd been dreading and craving all at once. He showed up at my door, looking as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't broken me into 1,000 pieces. He flashed that same smile, the one that used to make my heart skip a beat, and he asked if we could talk. I knew what he wanted. He wanted to smooth things over, to sweep the mess under the rug, and pretend like everything was fine. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I'd spent too many nights waiting for him to show up, too many days bending over backward for someone who'd never given me a second thought. And as I looked at him, standing there with that familiar, careless grin, I felt something shift inside me. A sense of calm, a quiet confidence I hadn't known I possessed. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and I looked him in the eye. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice steady, calm. I saw the confusion flash across his face, followed by a hint of anger, of disbelief. But I didn't waver. For the first time, I wasn't begging, wasn't pleading for him to stay, to love me. I was letting him go, freeing myself from the chains that had held me captive for so long. As he walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting off my shoulders. It was over, finally over. And though I knew there would be lonely nights ahead, moments when I'd miss him, miss the idea of what we could have been, I also knew I'd made the right choice. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need him to be whole. I didn't need anyone's validation or approval to feel complete. I was enough, just as I was. And as I stood there, watching him fade into the distance, I felt a surge of strength, a quiet resilience that had been buried inside me all along. After he left that day, a sense of peace settled over me, a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. But as freeing as it was to let him go, I knew my journey was far from over. The memories of what I'd been through, the loneliness, the hurt, the betrayal, still lingered. A constant reminder of the years I'd wasted on people who didn't value me. I realized then that if I was truly going to move on, I needed to confront more than just him. I needed to confront everything and everyone who had taken a piece of me and left me feeling empty. So I started making changes. I cut off toxic friends, people who had only ever reached out when they needed something, who had taken my kindness and turned it into an expectation. I stopped being the person who was always available, always there to pick up the pieces for everyone else. I began setting boundaries, letting people know that I wouldn't be treated like an option anymore. And though some people tried to guilt me, to make me feel selfish for choosing myself, I stood firm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bending to anyone's expectations, but my own. One day, word got back to me that he'd been bad-mouthing me, telling mutual friends that I was too needy, too emotional. He painted himself as the victim, making it seem as if I'd driven him away with my constant demands for attention. The audacity of it was almost laughable. After everything he'd put me through, he had the nerve to make himself out to be the martyr, the one who'd suffered in our relationship. I knew then that I needed to set the record straight, not for him, but for myself. So I did something I'd never thought I'd have the courage to do. I confronted him publicly. At a mutual friends gathering, I found myself standing in front of him, looking him in the eye, and I laid everything out, all the lies, the broken promises, the betrayals. I didn't raise my voice, didn't let anger take control. Instead, I spoke calmly, each word filled with the quiet strength that had been growing inside me. I told him exactly how he'd made me feel, the way he'd torn me down piece by piece, the way he'd taken my love and treated it like it was disposable. He tried to laugh it off, to play it cool, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes, the way he shifted nervously under my gaze. I wasn't the same girl he'd walked all over. I was stronger now, braver, and he could see it. When I finished, there was a stunned silence. People around us stared, some with pity, others with respect. I could see the realization dawning on them, that I wasn't the needy, broken girl he'd made me out to be. I was someone who had endured, who had come out the other side stronger and wiser. I didn't need his validation, didn't need him to understand or apologize. I just needed to say my piece, to let him know that he no longer had any power over me. Afterward, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of freedom I hadn't known was possible. I'd taken back my voice, my power, and in doing so, I'd reclaimed a part of myself I'd thought I'd lost forever. And in that moment, I realized that this was the revenge I'd been searching for. Not some grand act of vengeance, but the simple act of standing up for myself, of refusing to let anyone define me or my worth ever again. Walking away from that gathering, I felt a sense of triumph, a quiet victory that no one could take away from me. I didn't need anyone's approval or validation. I had given that to myself. For the first time, I felt whole, complete, no longer tied to anyone else's opinions or expectations. From that day on, I was free. Not just from him, but from the version of myself that had lived in constant fear of being abandoned, of not being enough. I was no longer the girl waiting by the phone, hoping for someone to show up. I was someone new, someone strong, someone who knew her worth and refused to settle for anything less. And as I walked away, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope. Hope for a future that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval, a future that was mine to shape, to build. I didn't need anyone to save me, I had saved myself. In the weeks that followed that confrontation, I felt a shift deep within me, a kind of calm I hadn't known before. The ache, the hollow emptiness that had been my constant companion, started to fade. It was strange at first, learning to live without that weight, that constant anxiety about whether I was enough. But I knew this was what freedom felt like, the freedom I'd fought so hard to earn. I began to focus on building a life that felt like my own, one not defined by someone else's needs or expectations. I threw myself into my work, taking on projects I'd always been too afraid to try. For the first time, I wasn't worried about failing or disappointing anyone. I was doing it for me, for the sheer joy of seeing what I was capable of when I finally let myself shine. And as I started to rebuild, I found myself reconnecting with the parts of me I'd lost along the way. I started painting again, something I'd abandoned years ago. There was a comfort in it, a way to express the things I couldn't put into words. With every brushstroke, I felt like I was reclaiming pieces of myself, filling in the gaps that had been left behind by years of hurt and neglect. In time, I even began to open myself up to new relationships, new friendships with people who saw me, who valued me for who I was. These weren't the shallow, one-sided connections I'd been used to. These were real, honest, and supportive relationships built on mutual respect and care. And with each new bond, I realized that I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was no longer afraid of not being enough. Looking back, it was almost surreal to think about everything I'd been through. The years of waiting, hoping, shrinking myself to fit into a space that had never been meant for me. It felt like a different life. A different person. And in many ways, it was. I wasn't the same person anymore. I was stronger, wiser, and finally at peace with myself. One afternoon, as I walked through the park, feeling the sun on my face and the breeze in my hair, I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs. I wasn't haunted by old memories or regrets anymore. I wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. I was free. In that moment, I smiled, realizing that I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all along. Not love from someone else, but love from myself. I'd found the strength to move on, to build a life that was truly mine. And as I looked out at the world around me, I felt a quiet confidence, a sense of purpose that I knew would carry me forward. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need anyone's validation. I was enough, just as I was. And for the first time in my life, I knew I would be okay. The past was behind me now, a chapter I'd closed, a story I'd outgrown. I was ready to start a new one that would be written on my terms, in my own voice. And as I took that first step into the unknown, I felt a thrill of excitement, a promise of all the things yet to come. Because this time I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. I was my own hero, and I knew I could face whatever lay ahead. And that, more than anything else, was the victory I'd been fighting for all along.